And mines are using chemicals laphayana. They are using chemicals that are very strong.
There hasn't been a large-scale medical study on the impact of the mine dumps. But in this one small neighborhood, we met 4 children with cerebral palsy, and the community is convinced that's significant.
For more than 50 years, Niger supplied the world with one of its most valuable resources, uranium. It powered nuclear reactors in Europe, fueled medical industries, and kept France's electricity grid alive. Yet the country that provided the fuel remained one of the poorest on Earth. For decades, French company Orano operated at the heart of Niger's uranium belt, extracting wealth while leaving behind questions no one ever fully answered. That uneasy relationship finally collapsed in 2025, when Niger's new military government took control of its mines and pushed Orano out. Paris called it unfair. Niamey called it liberation. But everything changed when officials inspecting abandoned sites near Arlit found something alarming. 400 barrels of radioactive material lying exposed in the desert, leaking toxins far above safe levels. Niger immediately accused Orano of environmental crimes. Now the world wants to know, how did those barrels get there? And what did they reveal about the past 50 years? Let's find out. When Niger's new military-led government ordered a comprehensive inspection of former uranium sites around Arlit, the mission sounded routine. For decades, northern Niger had been a quiet extraction zone serving foreign companies, particularly France's nuclear giant, Orano. Mines opened, mines closed, trucks moved in and out, and the desert swallowed whatever traces were left behind. But in 2025, for the first time in the country's history, Niger decided to examine that desert with its own eyes instead of relying on foreign reports. What began as a simple environmental review soon turned into a revelation that would ignite one of Africa's most explosive geopolitical confrontations. The inspectors didn't expect to find anything dramatic, maybe residue, maybe rusted equipment, maybe a few abandoned containers. What they found instead were barrels, hundreds of them, scattered across the sand in Madawaila, just outside Arlit, where Orano and its predecessor companies had operated for decades. Some barrels were intact, others had cracked, their contents exposed. All of them were silent. But when technicians switched on their radiation meters, the silence broke. The numbers shot upward, 7 to 10 microsieverts per hour, a reading that no open-air environment should ever produce. Normal desert radiation sits around 0.5 microsieverts. What Niger's inspectors were standing in was not slightly elevated. It was dangerous. It was contamination. It was a sign that someone at some point had abandoned radioactive core material in the open without disposal, safety measures, or even a warning sign. At first, the team assumed it might be from recent activity, but that theory collapsed immediately. Orano claimed it had not operated in Madawaila and held no license there. Yet the barrels were only a short distance away from the broader uranium belt where French extraction had dominated for 5 decades. Their age, condition, and location told a story of long-term neglect, not a recent mistake. When Niger's findings reached Niamey, the reaction was explosive. The government publicly accused Orano of predatory behavior, environmental crimes, and potential mass crimes. No diplomatic language, no cautious phrasing. This was the clearest, boldest allegation Niger had ever made against its former mining partner. Officials described the discovery not as pollution, but as poisoning of land, of air, of a community forced to live beside invisible hazards. But why was this discovery so politically powerful? Because it came only months after Niger had nationalized the Somaïr mine, stripping Orano of its 63.4% stake and asserting complete control over its uranium for the first time in its modern history. France saw the nationalization as aggression. Niger saw it as independence. And now, the radioactive barrels became physical proof, tangible, measurable, undeniable, that something had gone terribly wrong under foreign management. The government was no longer accusing a company of bad accounting or unfair contracts. It was accusing a global nuclear supplier of contaminating Nigerian soil and leaving radioactive waste in the open near civilian areas. And so the question grew louder. If these 400 barrels were left behind, What else was hidden in the desert that Niger was never meant to discover? Niger did not hesitate to answer the question raised by the discovery. The government went straight for the heart of the matter. It accused Orano, France's state-owned nuclear fuel company, of being responsible. Not indirectly responsible. Not vaguely connected. Directly responsible. The same company that had shaped Niger's uranium industry for half a century was now being painted as the source of radioactive waste abandoned in the desert. And the language Niamey used was not diplomatic. It was surgical. It was sharp. It was meant to cut. Justice Minister Alio Daouda stood before the press, held up the radiation readings, and declared that the contamination in Madaouela was far higher than normal and dangerous to human health. He explained that tests had detected 2 harmful substances linked to respiratory problems, substances that should never have been left in an unprotected environment. He called the entire scene an environmental crime, a predatory act, and a possible mass crime if long-term exposure was proven. For a government that had just removed French troops and rejected French influence, this was more than an environmental report. It was a political indictment. Orano responded with a denial so strong it almost sounded rehearsed. "We have no license at Madaouela," the company said. "We conducted no operations there." They insisted they had received no legal notice from Niger and that they were being accused of actions they could not possibly have committed. But the denial raised more questions than it answered. If Orano never worked there, how could radioactive core material be sitting next to the region where Orano, formerly Areva, had dominated uranium extraction for decades? How could 400 barrels appear in a desert that had been under French mining activity since the 1970s? Niger's government did not accept Orano's explanation. They believed these barrels were remnants of past extraction phases, when oversight was weaker, documentation looser, and environmental responsibility almost non-existent. They believed the barrels survived because no one ever expected Niger to check. And they believed Orano genuinely thought this chapter of history would stay buried beneath the sands. But why was Niger pushing this so aggressively now? Why launch a public confrontation with France's most strategically important mining company? Because the discovery came at the perfect moment, right after Niger nationalized the Somaïr mine, expropriating Orano's 63.4% stake. The two sides were already on opposite sides of an economic war. Every accusation, every press statement, every revelation had geopolitical consequences. The stakes were not just environmental, they were financial, diplomatic, and strategic. If Orano were proven guilty of environmental crimes, France's decades-long moral claim to be a responsible partner in Africa would collapse. And Niger knew that, which led to an even sharper question, one that France was desperate to avoid. Was the radioactive scandal just pollution, or evidence that Niger was right to seize Orano's uranium mine in the first place?
Niger's junta have announced that they are putting their uranium from the Somaïr mine on the open market. Somaïr, once majority controlled by French nuclear giant Orano, was nationalized by the junta in June, stripping Orano of any control.
Niger's answer to its own question was blunt. Yes, the radioactive discovery reinforced exactly why the government seized Orano's uranium mine. The nationalization of the Somaïr mine was not a symbolic gesture. It was a calculated break from a 50-year structure in which France controlled Niger's uranium, dictated the terms, and left Niger with a fraction of the benefits. When the military-led government took power, it didn't just inherit a nation, it inherited a resource map dominated by foreign companies. And Somaïr was the biggest piece on that map. In June 2025, Niger made a move that Paris never imagined was possible. It nationalized Orano's 63.4% stake in Somaïr, pushing the French company out of operational control. With one decision, Niger effectively declared that its uranium would no longer fuel another country's prosperity while its own citizens lived in poverty. The reaction from France was immediate outrage. The reaction from Niger was unwavering confidence. But what happened next escalated the confrontation into open conflict. Even though the World Bank's International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes (ICSID) issued a ruling ordering Niger not to touch the uranium stockpile at Somaïr, the government ignored it, not quietly, not secretly, publicly. Niger began transporting the uranium itself. loading trucks under the desert sun and sending them out despite warnings, pressure, and legal threats. Orano condemned this instantly, calling it illegal, irresponsible, and dangerous. They said Niger's transport methods might not meet international safety standards. They accused the government of mishandling radioactive material in a way that could harm workers and the public. But Niger dismissed those accusations almost casually. For them, the radioactive barrels found in Maduela were proof enough of who had mishandled uranium in the past. The government framed the uranium transport as an act of sovereignty, not theft, but reclamation. For the first time in 50 years, Niger was touching its own uranium without foreign supervision. It was a political statement and an economic one. It was a message to France. We don't need your permission anymore. This is where the entire dispute transformed. What began as an environmental scandal has now become intertwined with a legal battle, an economic struggle, and a geopolitical shift. The radioactive barrels didn't just expose contamination. They gave Niger moral leverage. They allowed the government to argue that France's operations weren't just unfair, they were unsafe. But transporting uranium wasn't only about symbolism, it was about value. The Somaïr stockpile held a massive amount of uranium, some of the most sought after in the world, and by moving it themselves, Niger was positioning itself to negotiate its own deals, set its own prices, and choose its own partners. Which raises the next unavoidable question. If Niger were now in full control of its uranium, who would they be planning to sell it to, and what would that mean for global power dynamics? Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. Niger didn't nationalize the Somaïr mine just to store uranium in a warehouse. The moment it took control, the question became, who would buy the uranium now that France was out of the picture? And the answer came swiftly, through a quiet but explosive detail revealed by Reuters. Sitting inside the nationalized mine was 1,500 metric tons of uranium, one of the most valuable untapped stockpiles on the continent. That number changed everything. It meant Niger wasn't merely reasserting sovereignty, it was stepping into the global nuclear market as an independent seller. And suddenly, countries that had no access to Western-controlled uranium began paying attention. According to reporting, interest surfaced from Turkey, Iran, and Russia, three nations whose involvement would instantly turn a commercial dispute into a geopolitical flashpoint. If Turkey bought Nigerian uranium, it would strengthen Ankara's bid to expand its nuclear program beyond energy into strategic capabilities. If Iran gained access, it would raise alarms in Western capitals, given the sensitivity around Tehran's nuclear ambitions. And if Russia entered the deal, it would extend Moscow's influence across Africa's emerging energy landscape, further cementing its position as a global nuclear power. In other words, Niger's uranium wasn't just valuable, it was strategically dangerous for France and its allies to lose control of it. For Paris, this wasn't about losing profit, it was about losing leverage. France relies on nuclear reactors for 70% of its electricity, and Niger once supplied a significant portion of that fuel. Even though France diversified in recent years, the symbolic and strategic loss of Niger's uranium stung deeply. But watching that uranium potentially flow toward geopolitical rivals was even worse. This is why Orano condemned Niger's transport operation as unsafe and illegal. It wasn't only about safety standards, it was about urgency. It was about France realizing it no longer had a monopoly over Niger's resources. And it was about stopping the uranium from reaching countries that France did not want to be empowered. Niger, on the other hand, saw an opportunity. After decades of selling uranium under contracts that favored foreign companies, the possibility of negotiating directly with new buyers who viewed Niger as a partner instead of an extraction site, was transformative. This was more than an economic shift. It was a rewriting of power. And Niger wasn't alone. Across the Sahel, governments in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Guinea were also removing French influence and reclaiming natural resources. A larger regional realignment was taking place, and Niger's uranium was one of its most powerful symbols. But returning to the central point, as Niger explored new buyers, one question became impossible to ignore, especially for France. How did this region suddenly gather enough confidence to break France's grip on its minerals and rewrite decades of political dependence? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. The answer lies far beyond Niger's borders. What gave Niger the confidence to seize mines, accuse a French nuclear giant of environmental crimes, and negotiate uranium deals with Russia, Turkey, and Iran wasn't just internal courage, it was the seismic shift happening across the entire Sahel. Over the past 3 years, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Guinea all broke from France in dramatic, unprecedented ways. French troops were expelled, military agreements were torn up, and new alliances were formed with Russia and other non-Western powers. Suddenly, France's influence, once unquestioned, collapsed across a region it had shaped for more than 6 decades. For Niger's leaders, this wasn't just inspiring, it was instructive. They watched Mali eject thousands of French soldiers without consequences. They watched Burkina Faso nationalize gold assets and reject IMF pressure. They watched Guinea renegotiate mining contracts on terms favorable to the state. The Sahel was no longer afraid of Western retaliation, and that regional defiance became a shield Niger could stand behind. In this new political climate, nationalizing the Somaïr uranium mine didn't make Niger an outlier, it made Niger part of a collective wave, a block of countries redefining sovereignty in real time. And once Niger stood inside that block, France became just another foreign power, not an untouchable authority. This is exactly why the 400 radioactive barrels mattered so much. Before, environmental accusations against a French company would have been politically unthinkable. France was too powerful, the dependency too deep, the consequences too big. But in 2025, Niger no longer saw France as a partner, only as a former owner overstaying its welcome. Exposing radioactive waste wasn't an act of hostility, it was an act of liberation, and the symbolism was too perfect to ignore. For years, West Africans have accused France of extracting wealth and leaving behind poverty. Now Niger had a literal example: uranium taken away, radioactive waste left behind. That narrative ignited public anger and gave the government the political fuel it needed to confront Orano without hesitation. The scandal wasn't just about contamination, it became a metaphor for the entire colonial relationship. Meanwhile, the region's new alliances reinforced Niger's confidence. Without French troops on their soil and with growing Russian security cooperation, West African governments realized France no longer had the ability or the political capital to intervene militarily. The old threat was gone. The old hierarchy was gone. The fear was gone. This regional unity created a psychological shift just as powerful as the political one. For the first time in modern history, the Sahel was acting not as isolated states, but as a strategic coalition with shared enemies, shared partners, and shared goals. And in such a coalition, no country stood alone. If France retaliated against one, it would be retaliating against all. That safety net made Niger's stance even more unshakable. But this regional transformation raises the most important question yet, one that affects not only Niger, but every country challenging old systems of power. If West Africa has broken free from France, what will be the ultimate global consequence of Africa choosing sovereignty over submission? The answer is already unfolding: a global recalibration of power, triggered not by weapons or sanctions, but by Africa's decision to reclaim what has always been its own. Niger's uranium dispute with Orano is no longer just an African story. It is reshaping energy security in Europe, nuclear strategy in the Middle East, diplomatic alignments across Asia, and the balance of power between the West and the global South. For the first time in modern geopolitical history, Africa has weaponized resources, not rebellion, to change its place in the world. The uranium Niger, once exported under France's terms, now sits at the center of multiple international agendas. France relied on Nigerian uranium to fuel nuclear reactors that generate 70% of its electricity. Losing access to that fuel source, or worse, watching it redirected to rivals, creates a strategic vulnerability Paris cannot ignore. This is why France has responded with legal pressure, political messaging, and warnings about safety standards. But none of those tools work the way they used to. Africa is no longer intimidated. Then there are the new buyers. If Iran gains access to Nigerian uranium, Western governments will see it as a threat to non-proliferation efforts. If Turkey expands its nuclear capacity with Nigerian fuel, it shifts NATO's internal dynamics. If Russia deepens its energy partnership with Niger, it strengthens Moscow's influence in a region the West once considered its own backyard. What was once a simple mineral sale is now a potential geopolitical trigger. But the biggest shift is psychological. For decades, African countries were framed as dependent on Western aid, unable to negotiate fair terms, and incapable of controlling their own resources. Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Guinea have shattered that narrative. By rejecting French dominance and forming alliances based on mutual benefit rather than historical obligation, these nations have forced the world to address Africa as a sovereign power bloc, not a passive resource reservoir. This new reality also disrupts global corporate systems. Multinational companies like Orano were accustomed to operating in Africa with minimal challenge. Environmental oversight was weak. Political resistance was limited. Western governments acted as quiet guarantors. But Niger's radioactive barrel scandal revealed just how vulnerable these corporations are when African states decide to audit the past. If Niger proves environmental crimes, it sets a precedent, one that other African nations could use to renegotiate contracts, demand compensation, or even file legal claims against decades of mismanagement. And this leads to the most profound transformation. African nations are beginning to see their resources not as gifts to foreign powers, but as instruments of leverage. Uranium in Niger, gold in Burkina Faso, bauxite in Guinea, phosphates in Mali. Africa is recognizing that controlling these resources means controlling the terms of engagement. It means writing the contracts, setting the prices, and choosing partners based on benefit, not pressure. Which brings us to the final question, the one that will shape the next decade of global politics. Now that Africa has tasted sovereignty and discovered its power, will the world accept a new Africa rising or attempt to force the old order back into place? Let us know in the comment section. Will France suffer? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about, the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.